Welcome back to We Married the Family, the place for all your in-law issues, questions, and explorations as a daughter-in-law and as a couple. Today's episode is about neurodivergence amongst daughter-in-laws with neurotypical in-laws. Myself and my good friend and fellow counselling psychologist Dr. Kristen Scott have been talking about neurodivergence between ourselves for the last 7 or 8 years. And it wasn't too long ago that she shared a book with me called Women with ADHD by Suri Solden. Then a couple of weeks later, we attended an ADHD and Women Summit here in Bristol. I'm not an expert in this area, but I'll be sharing things I've learned so far from books, speakers, research, and my own work with clients. We hear a lot about neurodiversity these days, and most of you might not even associate yourself with anything to do with neurodivergence until you know what you don't know. When I started that book, I knew I needed to make an episode about it, mainly because there are huge cultural factors that can make it hard for women to recognise that they are neurodivergent. And because it made me wonder how many daughters-in-law might struggle even more after marriage because of their neurodivergence. If you can recognise it, you can become so much better resourced to live with it. Nothing in this episode is diagnostic or to be taken as your personal truth. I'd recommend reading more on the subject, maybe joining forums and getting an assessment if the information that you're taking in resonates. But you also don't have to have an assessment to know for yourself whether you are neurodivergent or not. Before I go any further, I want to define what I'm talking about. So neurodiversity is the concept that refers to the uniqueness of every human brain. Our brains are as unique as we are. And you can see it in the name. Neuro as in the brain, the neurons or nerve cells and fibers within the brain, and diversity as in differences. So it's the differences in the wiring of our brains. But within this diversity, there is a quote-unquote normal way of functioning, which we refer to as neurotypical. And there's divergence from this norm, which we refer to as neurodivergence. And this includes the spectrum of autism and ADHD, dyslexia and dyspraxia, amongst other things. In today's episode, I'm focusing more on ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is a neurodevelopmental disorder. I'll be focusing on ADHD in women and the cultural aspect of being a daughter-in-law who is neurodivergent, looking at the ways that cultural norms might lead to increased masking and shame, and the excess struggles that you face as a neurodivergent daughter-in-law. And I'm going to be using that phrase a lot, and it is a mouthful, so bear with me. In the book I referred to earlier, Women with Attention Deficit Disorder, the author Suri Solden talks about how women's symptoms often show up differently to men's and how society plays a part in women's masking of the symptoms and the difficulty in getting a diagnosis because of the gender gap. The more typical presentation of ADHD that we commonly hear about and that you might be most familiar with includes things like impulsivity and hyperactivity. So this is excessive movement, excessive talking, interrupting others, restlessness, fidgeting. But Suri focuses on the lesser known but equally challenging patterns of inattentive ADHD, which is more common in women. Unlike the more externalized aspects of ADHD, like hyperactivity and impulsivity, inattentive ADHD includes more internalized symptoms, which makes it harder to spot. It includes things like forgetfulness, distractibility, making careless mistakes, a difficulty keeping up with payments, letters, appointments, a struggle to focus, a struggle to follow instructions, and follow through on projects, often not seeing things to completion, losing and misplacing things. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it gives you an idea of the differences between the hyperactive and the inattentive forms of ADHD. A woman with inattentive ADHD can also have traits of hyperactivity and impulsivity, but usually to a lesser degree. One of the things that contributes to women's symptoms being missed is something called masking. We all do some form of masking to some degree, whether it comes to our racial identity, our mental health struggles and emotions, or our ADHD symptoms. This is where you hide your true way of being so that you can fit in and avoid judgment and criticism. You just try and be in society like everybody else. But masking is such an effortful thing. If a woman struggles with instructions, with planning, with remembering details, And then on top of that, she's really trying her best to not be found out, not to mess up. It's going to be really hard and tiring for her to get through any typical day. And also because those inattentive symptoms are more internal, it is easier for them to be misjudged and wrongly attributed to some other fault within a person, like a carelessness or a chaoticness in their personality. Our society generally has so many expectations of women, but culturally we have an absolutely ridiculous amount. And we are really unforgiving towards women when they don't meet these ridiculous expectations. So masking is like a survival strategy in a culture like this. It keeps you safe, but it comes at a cost to yourself. As a daughter-in-law who is neurodivergent and living with in-laws, you not only have the same expectations as others, but your neurodivergence makes it more difficult to sustain these demands in the way that you and other people would like you to. Let's take an example of sustaining relationships. From a cultural and a faith perspective, we are taught how important it is to maintain ties of kinship. But if you struggle with small talk, or you find it hard to think of responses on the spot, or you get distracted mid-conversation, or you procrastinate and find it hard to have phone conversations, and you feel that people just don't understand you and that you can't keep up with other people, then it's really taxing to sustain several or dozens of relationships with individual members of the in-laws, with your own family, with your extended family, with your husband's extended family. And you might have people shaming you in front of others, saying things like, "Oh, you never call us. We never hear from you. How hard is it to pick up the phone? Are you too busy to call us? Or look who decided to show up today." Or when people remind you that you should call us every day, you should phone us more, you probably don't like us if you're not calling us. Even this ongoing instructing and demanding and criticizing can feel really weighty for a person with ADHD. And that itself can make you resist the very thing that people want from you. It can push you into a sense of paralysis because there's such a big expectation attached to it. Other people might feel that you don't care about them, or that you don't care to keep in touch, that you're being self-centered, but this could be quite far from the truth of what's actually happening for you. If you're a daughter-in-law with ADHD and you are responsible for the running of your in-laws' home, including cleaning, cooking, groceries, possibly whilst raising your own child or children, you will find it hard. I mean, these things can be hard for anyone, but for women with ADHD, the difficulty level increases. You might, for example, forget to check what's needed before leaving the house on your way to the store, so you have to make multiple trips. Or then hear people complain that, "Oh, you didn't even buy what we needed," or make a joke like, "What did you even get?" You might struggle to cook because you're trying to plan it around the time when the kitchen is free, but that might not coincide with your own schedule. Or you might miss your slot because you got distracted doing something else, and now you're hearing comments like, "She hasn't cooked again." Because we know some in-laws keep a tally of that, and then you feel that you're not measuring up. It can also show up in places where plans are changing. So you might have your own plan for the day, but then your mother-in-law or your husband might spring something on you quite last minute, and it completely throws you off. And then you have a hard time adjusting to the change emotionally and practically. So something that could be enjoyable or a minor inconvenience for other people puts you into a frenzy or even sometimes a bit of an emotional meltdown. Maybe you have kids and you find it hard to keep the home organized, and instead of your in-laws asking you if you need a hand or your husband working with you to get things in order, you get criticized and called lazy and messy and dirty, because we also know that some in-laws have ridiculous standards for housekeeping. If any of this has happened to you, then I am sorry for your experiences, and I hope that by becoming more familiar with your own neurodivergence, it can help you to stop making this into a you problem, because you're not deficient and you're not a failure. Your brain works differently, and you need different systems and support. Now, when it comes to the attitudes of those around you, you can educate people, but that's different from explaining yourself to others. You don't need to explain yourself. These days, because it is increasingly common to hear that someone has ADHD, family members might not take you seriously. They might think you're making excuses. They might not take the time to understand and to listen to you. And it's not your responsibility to change them. If they did know, then what difference would that make to you? There's no guarantee that it'll make anything easier for you, so you have to use your own judgment in knowing who to talk to about this. I would prioritize your marriage and having that understanding between you and your spouse rather than other family members initially, unless they were receptive and supportive and not going to humiliate you or use your struggle against you. If the ADHD symptoms go unnoticed, then it's likely that other meanings are being made. You might have a lot of anger towards yourself. You might be struggling with your self-esteem. You've probably also struggled with or are currently struggling with depression or anxiety, because these mental health struggles can co-occur with ADHD, especially when you don't know what's what. The story that you tell yourself about why all these cognitive and behavioral difficulties are happening, and why your stress levels are high, and why your days are chaotic and difficult and draining is really important. Think about a woman with ADHD who is telling herself, oh my gosh, I'm so stupid, I'm so careless, why do I keep making these mistakes? I keep getting everything wrong. That woman is going to feel very different to the woman who knows that her brain works differently and that the systems that she currently has need to be changed so that they can be more facilitative rather than a hindrance. It will make a big difference if you can recognize for yourself what is happening and be kinder to yourself, even if other people don't know or don't understand. It's likely only going to be those people who are closest to you, who know how much of a struggle you face on a daily basis. Maybe your in-laws are noticing and your husband is noticing that you keep repeatedly making a certain error, or that you are forgetful, or that you keep misplacing things. And that feels exposing because you're not able to mask these parts of you like you can with the outside world. I would encourage you to learn more about it first so that you can find some relief and work on dropping your own self-criticism, self-blame, and self-shame. Work on being more compassionate with yourself. ADHD and neurodivergence isn't a bad or shameful thing. And if you can change your view of it and your relationship to it, then you'll also find it easier to show up more authentically and to talk about it if you want to. Being neurodivergent brings so many gifts with it too. People with ADHD are often more creative. They can be more ambitious. They have great vision and they can see things that other people don't. And they seek genuine and authentic connections. If you're having a hard time accepting your ADHD, think about what your own judgments are about it and start looking for some of the gifts that it holds and brings into your life and the life of those around you. Often a person with ADHD will have family members who also have ADHD or are neurodivergent. So also look out for it within your family of origin, maybe amongst your siblings, your parents. And this will help you to feel less alone and to feel more connected, and to know that actually there is a shared experience of this within the system that you've grown up in. I'm also curious as to how many people within our culture are neurodivergent and do have ADHD. Because even though we think of this as something that's quite Eurocentric, that's quite a Western concept, there might actually be more people within our own culture that are neurodivergent than we realize. Sometimes it can be helpful to go for an assessment to clarify your own knowing and to help you to create a more helpful narrative and a more truthful and accurate one as well. Someone sent in a question about pregnancy and ADHD symptoms, so I just want to share a little bit about that here before going further into the assessment. There is a hormonal factor with ADHD too, which can make it more complicated to diagnose and treat in women. Estrogen, which is the hormone that plays a central role during puberty, during our periods, during pregnancy and menopause, amongst other things that it does. It's also one of the hormones that regulates production of dopamine and areas of executive functioning and the reward center in our brains. So for women, our estrogen level is fluctuating a considerable amount throughout our lives, and it also correlates with the changes in dopamine. So when estrogen is lower, dopamine is also lower, and when estrogen is higher, so are the number and the responsiveness of the dopamine receptors. Your ADHD symptoms can worsen during different times of the month and different stages of your life because of this. So if you're on medication, you will require more or less stimulants depending on your hormonal changes that are happening. If you want to learn more about the sciencey hormonal part of it, then you can search the work of Dr. Jane Cedric Muller and Dr. Sandra Cui, who is really at the forefront of research in adult ADHD. So going back to assessment, some of you might feel that you want to go for an assessment or get a diagnosis, but you're unsure about how to go about it. So the first thing that you will want to do is to find a health professional who specializes in ADHD screening and assessments. In the UK, you can go to your GP, you can discuss your concerns with your GP, and they can make a referral to a specialist through the NHS who will do your assessment and suggest treatment, and you can do your treatment within the NHS. It won't be the GP themselves who do the assessment, but they will be able to get the ball rolling for you. Or you can go to someone privately to obviously reduce the waiting times, but it is more expensive and you'll also need to pay for the treatment, so make sure you have the funds for that. Something to keep in mind is that if you have had a diagnosis privately or you're thinking about going privately, you won't necessarily get treatment through the NHS after a private diagnosis. It's more likely that you're going to need to go through the NHS for an assessment, even if you've had it done privately. So that's something to keep in mind, because otherwise you'll be doubling up on the assessment. And if you do decide to go privately, then please do your research about the person that you book in with. Make sure that they're well versed in this area and that they've got a level of experience that you're happy with. Sadly, because a lot of people have been jumping on the bandwagon to make extra money, and we all know that getting an assessment or evaluation for ADHD can be really costly. So definitely do your research. Whoever you decide to go with, they will use different tools alongside the criteria for ADHD in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health. They will assess the presence of symptoms, the way that these symptoms impact your daily functioning, and they'll check for any other issues that you might have to rule out any other causes, because ADHD symptoms can and do overlap with other mental and physical health issues and vice versa. So they will assess if something else is happening at the same time. Something else to keep in mind is that before you go for an assessment, it can be helpful to write things down as you notice them happening in your day, because sometimes when you get to the assessment, you won't be able to recall things in that moment. So it's just helpful to have clear examples that you can share during the appointment. And then depending on the outcome of your assessment, you'll be offered different treatment options, which can include medication. But you can also find a therapist or a support group where you can talk through your struggles and receive some support for them and hear from other people as well who are going through similar things. You can get a coach who can help you with the practical side of things. So organization, financial issues, and social skills. Your ADHD doesn't have to stop you from living the life that you want, but you will need to live that life in a different way than what you've been trying to so far. You might need to have different ways to remind yourself of appointments. That doesn't include post-it notes. Maybe you do something different in your morning routine where you have a couple of minutes to review your day instead of diving straight into it. You might want to prepare clothes the night before so that you don't lose energy and motivation in the morning. You might start to spread out your social commitments so that you're not overwhelmed by them. You might start being kinder to yourself when you do forget something instead of being critical and berating yourself. You might want to ask for a quieter place to work in the office. You might have set periods of the day where you turn your phone off or you leave it in another room to stop you getting distracted. If you're prone to missing payments, you might want to set up direct debits instead. Whatever isn't working for you right now requires a different approach, and you will need some trial and error with it. And even when you find what works for you, you will still make mistakes, you will still forget, you will still get stressed out, and that's okay. We're not aiming for perfection. We're just aiming for you to be able to live life that feels more organized and manageable and less overwhelming and chaotic. And also remember that what works for one person isn't guaranteed to work for you, and that's also okay. Your way of living is going to be based on your specific needs and your specific symptoms. In the description, I've put a link to the UK Adult ADHD Network and the name of a women's ADHD podcast that you can listen to. If you've benefited from today's episode, do like, comment, share, and subscribe. If you've been affected by anything discussed in today's episode and would like to work together, you can join my daughter-in-law's membership or book in for one-to-one therapy with myself or another therapist.